Okay.
I'm Bo Banducci. I'm a freshman
Okay. Freshman.
studying philosophy.
Okay.
I'm Mary, and I'm a freshman, and I'm undecided. So
I
yay.
understand.
I'm Kelsey. I'm a freshman too, and I'm studying political science.
Okay. All right. So you ready? Let's get good at with it.
Yes. So we're on an alternative break trip. Just it is our spring break, and we're focusing on the inequality in the DC public school system, and also kind of looking at Michelle Rhee's policies and what they may or may not be doing to affect that situation. And so we've heard some about her policies, like the red track and green track with tenure, and some about teacher firings that have been going on and that sort of thing. So I guess we were hoping to hear from you some about the union and about the relationship between the union and Michelle Rhee and her policies, and maybe some if there are disagreements among the members of the union about Rhee's reforms, and opinions about charter schools, TFA, and the implications for non-union teachers coming into the system.
Well, you're covering a lot, aren't you?
We do have to leave around 3:45ish.
All right. So why don't we take? Let's talk about relationship. All right. Let's take it from a union perspective. All right. The union represents teachers in the District of Columbia. Right. Now, we're at a stage in unionism, not just here in D.C., but I think across the nation, where there is a realization that unions now have to take on additional responsibilities. Early on, from a union perspective, our role was mainly benefits and compensation for teachers, and pretty much we call those bread and butter issues, and reform efforts and how the school system selected curriculum and all of that, we left to the school district, because all we were concerned about at certain points was, as I said, bread and butter issues. I think specifically here in D.C., we have a great number of charter schools. We're losing quite a few of our students to charter schools. Well, I don't have to tell you the impact of that is, as our students leave the public schools to move to charter schools, fewer students means you need fewer teachers, and fewer teachers means you have fewer union members, da 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 da. So from our perspective now, we have to be very concerned about the kind of reforms that are put in place, because those reforms have to be effective. Heretofore, we didn't have to worry about that much. Is that if the school district made mistakes on its educational plan, that's their problem, as long as our teachers were getting taken care of the bread and butter. Well, now it's essential that we look at and become a part of the reform to ensure that that reform is successful, because we want to stop the flow of children from DC public schools. Now, so I think I probably am probably one of the more progressive or flexible union presidents at this point. I mean, I get calls from my colleagues all the time, afraid that I may go too far in terms of the reform. But I do believe we have to do the kind of reform where we take on some responsibility for making sure that the school district and that schools are successful for our children. Now comes the contract negotiations. The major problem we have with the red and green tier that the chancellor had originally proposed is, look, the issue is not in this case whether or not the union agrees that teachers should receive some form of pay for performance. We realize that as in any other job. There are some people who work harder and have greater success than others, just like in sports or anything else. Not everybody makes the money that Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, and others make. Why? Because they perform better. The key is, for us, is that if you implement a system of performance pay, it has to be done in a way that is fair to teachers. It cannot be arbitrary and capricious in terms of determining who are the teachers who would get this additional performance. Now, the problem with the red and the green, and there was not a lot of problems with the red, because the red said everybody can get this. The problem came in terms of the green. The concept of saying, when we find our best teachers, we really want to award them appropriately, that's fine. The problem with the red and green is that, look, the chancellor put into the game something that's very, very critical that we believe is essential to ensuring fairness in the workplace, and that is tenure for teachers. The chancellor's proposal was that teachers who have already achieved tenure, all right, would have to give up their tenure for 1 year in order to qualify for this high pay scale, which was the green scale. Well, there are people, many people misunderstand what tenure is, and that's one of the bad raps that unions have had, is that people think that tenure guarantees a person a job regardless of how they perform. That's not true. The only thing that tenure gives a teacher is the right to due process. For example, when you are a probationary teacher, you don't have to be given a reason why you're terminated, period. You could be performing well, and they just say, we don't need you. All right, but once you get tenure, then the district has to prove that you either didn't meet the standard, or you had bad performance, or you committed some type of act that resulted in a disciplinary action that required you to be terminated. The tenure gives you the same rights that basically criminals get. And that is not enough for a policeman to say arrest you and say you committed a crime. You're entitled to due process where the prosecutor has to prove you committed the crime. And so as tenure says to a teacher, it's not enough once you get tenure for the principal to say, George Parker, you're a bad performer. You out of here. Principal's got to show some documentation. You had to come into my classroom, evaluate me, and show where I was a bad performer before you can terminate me. That's all tenure gives. And so the request in the chancellor's proposal that veteran teachers who already have tenure, the only way they could have access to this high pay scale is that they would have to put themselves at risk for a year of just arbitrarily being terminated if a principal chose to do so, went too far. And that's where the main source of disagreement on the chancellor's proposal was, and that's the main source where our teachers would not support. Now, we have some teachers who supported the proposal because of the funding. I mean, it was good money put out there. So if I'm a new teacher and a teacher who hasn't yet achieved tenure, it works for me because I don't have tenure anyway, and I want access to this great access to this money. But we felt though it was discriminatory against veteran teachers to say in order for you to take advantage of this high pay scale, you have to receive some type of punitive action. If it had been based on pure performance, and I've said that as a union leader, I'm willing to be very flexible on issues that really can improve student achievement, but I'm not willing to buy into something that simply is there to decrease the rights of workers. And there is no relationship between tenure and improving student achievement. If the process had been a teacher has to demonstrate through their performance that they are an outstanding teacher, and then they move to the high pay scale, that would have been reasonable. But when you say you can't move to the high pay scale unless you're willing to give up a right, that has no connection to improving schools. And so that's the main source of disagreement that we had in terms of the chancellor's proposal, in terms of compensation. Okay, so that gives you a pretty good picture. Now, the latest proposal that we presented to the chancellor was one that is very high on school reform and supports for teachers, mainly in the areas of professional development. One of the things that this district has not done very well, and that is provide the quality of professional development and support for both our new teachers and our veterans that are needed. For example, most of our new teachers come in through TFA and teaching fellows, and in many cases they do not come in through the traditional education schools where they got some background in pedagogy and other kind of things. And so when you put our new teachers in that kind of situation and you give them the key to a classroom, and they're pretty much left out there without a real strong support system, then those new teachers are going to do one or two things. They're simply going to fail, or they're going to get frustrated and they're going to leave. So we really want to have a very strong induction program for our new teachers that gives them full support for about 3 years. Research says that it takes roughly 3 years before a teacher hits his or her stride. So we want very strong professional development, and in our new proposal, that is a part of it. The other piece is resources. It's one thing to make demands of employees, but it's another thing to make those demands if you give the support. I have no argument with the president when he says, look, we got to get rid of poor teachers if we've given them the support that they need, and then they can't cut it, then they need to go. But the concept of using firing as a mechanism for transforming the system, you can't turn a system around by firing employees. You turn a system around by supporting the employees with the kind of resources that are needed to make the schools successful. And so we're heavy on a proposal that we have that is called a certified classroom. In other words, it's not enough to have a certified teacher. That's just one phase. You put a certified teacher in a classroom that doesn't have the appropriate resources and et cetera, you already put that teacher at a disadvantage. So our proposal is that you don't just stop with a certified teacher, move to a certified classroom. That means let's set a minimum standard that regardless of what classroom you're in DC public schools, whether it's west of the park, east of the river, that every student is going to have access to this standard of resources that teachers need in order to be successful. So I think the new proposal is very good in as much as it really talks about the kind of things that are going to be needed for transformation. The next piece is talking about a safe and disciplined environment. I mean, quite frankly, discipline in DC public schools is tough. I mean, it is really tough. And the district has not taken it, in my opinion, seriously enough to understand that if our teachers tell us that they spend at least 25% of their time dealing with behavior issues, well, then that means only 75% of the time that could be used for academic instruction is being used. And so it's time for us as a district to understand that you can't demand our teachers go into classrooms and teach in environments where they're threatened, where you have students that are just out of control, and you don't have the kind of intervention support services to help get that under control. So part of it is that we got to really work on discipline in DC public schools. It is out of control. As much as I think there's been this general effort to sweep a lot of stuff under the rug. Most people don't really know how bad it is, but our teachers know how bad it is. And so the other effort is to focus on making sure that we have a kind of safe and quality learning environment where teachers can go in the classroom and teach. And that's going to require having some alternative schools for students who really need those kind of intervention services. My approach is this, that every child is entitled to a high quality education, but no child is entitled to deny another child the right to an education because of his or her behavior. And we haven't, as a district, accepted the fact that some of our students' behavior is so disruptive that it really prevents the teachers from teaching the other children in the school. So the discipline piece is very, very important. Another focus is compensation. We realize that teachers need to be rewarded for outstanding work. So we have in our proposal, in addition to base salary, which I mean all teachers should be receiving because teaching is a tough job, school-wide incentives for schools that really meet AYP and show growth, but also individual incentives for teachers who really, similar to the chancellor, except it's not red and green. It's based on teachers can get school-wide incentives and pay for performance based on performance and not based on whether it's tenure or those other kind of things. And the last piece is we want a role in how we transform our low-performing schools because ultimately whether a school succeeds impacts us as a union, and et cetera. So we want them to have a voice in how the chancellor reforms our schools, because we want to make sure it's done in the right way, because successful schools mean a lot to us too. And that's pretty much where our proposal is at this point. Now, what else you need to talk about?
Anyone have any questions?
Yes.
We just met with Michelle Reed, and she made a point in support of TFA, saying that after 3 years, a teacher doesn't really change significantly in terms of the type of education they give. And you've pretty much just said the complete opposite, that it takes about 3 or 4 years to teacher to hit their stride where they feel comfortable in the classroom.
Right.
And so on and so on. Are there any studies that you can cite to agree with this, or I'm just curious maybe to expand on that thought a little more?
Go on the AFT website. They do so much research, and you can find it. I mean, it's pretty well standard that it takes a teacher about 3 years to reach a stride. Anyone who's a teacher can tell you. I mean, you have superstars, you know, in any category. I mean, but those aren't the people that's going to get you the championship. I mean, if you take basketball, look, LeBron James came out of high school and could go into the pros. But that's a rarity, all right? Kobe Bryant, that's a rarity. Most folks are going to have to go through the growth cycle of going to college, learning some other techniques as basketball players before they can get to the pros. But it's no different than teachers. Yeah, we get a superstar every now and then that can just come right out of TFA, jump right into the classroom, and for whatever reason, their God-given talent just, boom, they excel. But that is the exception. That's not the rule. The rule is it's going to take that teacher roughly 3 years with good support, all right, to get a handle on how to deal with quality teaching, because that classroom management piece is a struggle, especially in urban districts. You just don't walk in an urban school and had no experience and all of a sudden walk in there with a class of 7th graders and I'm ready to go. Those not the superstars may, but on the average, that's not going to happen. It's going to take some time and support to get you there.
Chancellor also made a point about professionally developing teachers that they choose to use the term invest in. And she just questions where undoubtedly there are some teachers that could do a lot better if they have more supports. But she was bringing up the point that the children that are in the classroom for that year, while the teacher is still underperforming and learning, her side is that, you know, it's not fair to the children to leave them in the care of that teacher. What would your response be?
Well, let's look at reality, all right? Outstanding teachers are developed. That's just a reality. You can't hire enough superstar teachers. They just don't exist, all right? So ultimately, you're going to have to develop personnel. It's no different than sports. I mean, look, you get a new player come into the league. You have the superstar that may go right in and start. But for the most part, it takes them a while before they really learn how to do it. And so my point is, you give that teacher the kind of support that is needed. It's a learning process. I think the concept that students can't wait, realistically, they have to, unless you can put a group of superstars in there. Now, what you can do with that teacher is that if you have a teacher that's struggling, rather than give that teacher 30 kids, why don't you give that teacher 15 kids? So it's an easier job. But the concept that we just kick this teacher out, where are you going to get the next one who comes in? Because the next one is going to have the same issues. He or she is going to have to be developed and supported, period.
Do you see policies coming out of Reed's administration as trying to undermine the union or dismantle the union, or a direct conflict with the union?
I think the chancellor has not been an advocate of unions. I mean, if you look at her writings before she even came here, she felt that unions have been presented blockages to many reform efforts in terms of turning the school systems around. In some cases, that may be true. I mean, as I said, unions for the most part have always been focused more on bread and butter issues. I think, though, the reality is unions and school districts have to work together. If you take our district, for example, you look at this, I said this in a radio interview recently, the chancellor cannot turn around DC public schools. The chancellor can help develop a plan that teachers, principals, and other persons can try to implement to turn DC public schools around. Because the chancellor doesn't teach one class, all right? So what the chancellor can do is help develop a culture. But the key is, if your employees, if the teachers don't buy into what your plan is, then it's not going to happen. We represent those employees. It's not as though I got into this office by buying this position. I got into this office by teachers electing me to represent them. So then it's important that the chancellor understand that the union represents those workers that she has to depend upon to implement, all right, the kind of policies and action plan that she develops, and that the union represents making sure that those employees get the kind of professional development and resources that are needed for them to do the job, even though it may sometimes be difficult, because our job is to criticize when it's necessary to criticize. Our job is to support when there should be support, okay? And so sometimes that become a thorn in the side, like it does for all of us. I mean, look, in my own job, I don't like it when I have to stand in front of members and take the criticism, but that's a reality. And so I think the chancellor would prefer not to have to deal with the union whenever the union is in disagreement, but that's just the reality. And I think it helps make the whole thing better. Any program needs to be really looked at, scrutinized, because the chancellor can make mistakes. And I think it's good to have more than one set of eyes on anything that's being proposed, because in the end, we all want a great, school system.
What does the union's communication with the chancellor's office look like, and like how often does that happen?
I think the communication is pretty good. Actually, I think my relationship with the chancellor is a lot better than the public perceives it. I mean, we're not angry at each other. When you disagree, you can disagree without being disagreeable. But when you disagree on policy, you disagree on policy. But I don't take it personal, and I don't think the chancellor takes it personal. So I think we have a decent relationship.
I just wanted to ask, a lot of charter schools that have had good results in raising scores and just creating a culture where kids learn a lot. Part of the reason that those charter school principals might attribute to that is the fact that they can get rid of teachers that don't do well at any time because they're non-unionized. How do you respond to that? Do you think that that's true? That might be part of the reason charter schools do so well in some areas, or?
I think number one that the charter schools do know better. If you saw the chancellor's testimony yesterday, she indicated that charter schools have not done any better. That's really a fact. Charter schools have not performed any better on the average than the public schools have. You have some bright spots like KIPP Academy and others, but you also have bright spots in the public school system. I think that's the disappointment of charters. Charters have not indicated that they are any better and perform any better, even though, quite frankly, charters have an advantage. For example, I can tell you in DCPS, and what we know pretty much how to read it. After charters get, their per pupil funding, which normally comes in October, if you're a public school teacher or principal, around November and December, we get this influx of students back. And guess who they are? They're the special needs students, and they're the discipline problems that the charter schools don't want. Because once they get the money doesn't follow the student. And so charters are able to hold on to the money, but they get the right to kick the student out. And so then the student comes back to the public school. And so now what happens to the public school? The public school has already received its budget for 320 students. And now they get 25 more charter school students that have been kicked out, but they don't get any extra money for it. So I think charter schools have a decided advantage in terms of they can kick kids out. Public schools have to accept them regardless. And they do that. I mean, if you follow DC's record, you'll see around November, December, we start getting this influx of kids back. And they are the discipline problems or it's the special needs kids that the charters don't want to have to provide the services for.
I've heard opposite things about the kicking out of students from charter schools. Do you have any idea of like numbers of like how many kids are kicked out of charter schools and are actually sent back to public schools?
We don't have accurate numbers, so I would be leery of giving you numbers. I know that it happens. Our teachers talk about it all the time, and it's something that's been discussed. I mean, and even at the council level, there's been testimony that this happens. The problem is when the Congress set up the charter school piece, it pretty much protected them against the money following the student. So once they get the money, they get to keep it. But they don't have the kind of guidelines in place because see, each charter within itself is treated as though it's a separate school system. So it sets up its own rules and regulations. So if it says you're out of here, then you're out of there. And so it's a part of how they do business. So their job should be easier. But again, in the public schools, it's a reality. Principals know that after they get the money, they can expect that the tough kids are going to be coming back to DC public schools.
I also have a question. We've seen a lot of teachers, I mean, we've been to one charter school, so we obviously don't have that much experience, but I mean, we've seen teachers in charter schools happy with the regulations that the charter schools apply for teaching there. You know, they might teach extended hours, but teachers we've met seem to be satisfied with their positions in charter schools. Why is the union necessary if teachers can be happy in areas where the union is unable to reach and you know, DCPS is unable to apply kind of union policies?
That's a good question. I think there are two things that you look at here. Why the union is necessary. Let me give you some examples. I can remember in DC when a teacher could be fired for being pregnant.
I mean, but we don't see this in charter schools.
Understand what I'm saying? The gains and the rights that teachers in public schools have, charter school teachers have them. They have them as a result of those rights existing in the public schools. So when you look at it and say, well, charter school teachers are happy, they are happy because the models, for the most part, that are in the charter schools are spin-off on what the leaders see have been acceptable in the public schools. For example, the class sizes and et cetera, you don't see the class sizes in the charter schools much exceeding what the public schools are. They look and see what public schools do, what unions have created in the public schools. So in a way, a lot of what charter schools are doing and the rights that teachers have in the charter schools have come as a result of what has become the norm for the public schools. So they would be satisfied.
But they aren't forced to implement these policies like public schools are because they don't have unionized teachers. Am I correct on that?
Say it again?
They aren't forced to implement like policies like class size in public schools, like public schools are, because they don't have unionized teachers. They just simply follow suit kind of with public schools.
Not necessarily. I mean, look, the risk for the teachers in the charter schools pretty much, and we get teachers from charters who will come to the public schools, the biggest risk for them is at will. If you look at KIPP in New York now, the teachers want to be organized. All right. So I think in the end, teachers began to see the need for a union. It is your only job protection. Unfortunately, we are not a society that just treat people right. It would be great. I mean, if you look at the civil rights movement, it would have been great if we didn't need the Voting Rights Act. You would think that people would want people to just have the right to vote. If you look at the struggle for to get Congresswoman Norton the right to vote in the House, all right, it would be great if people just said D.C. residents or citizens should have the right to vote and have a vote in the House. We just aren't a society that you can go into the workplace and expect your supervisors to always do what is right. And so what happens when your supervisor does not do what is right? Well, we've learned abuse occurs. And so people need their rights protected because we're all human and we're all subject to our own prejudices. And when those prejudices negatively impact another employee, then that causes harm. And you must have some protections to prevent the prejudicial acts of all of us from having negative impact on other people. And that's where unions come into place to say, look, we want everybody to be treated fairly, regardless of race, regardless of sex, regardless of whether they got an their ears pierced, a nose pierced, or whatever. Because you don't like someone coming in the room in the school because they got an earring in their nose. So you're going to try to fire that person. Well, that has nothing to do with their quality of teaching. And that's where union contracts come in.
I want to just to add to that, I know one of the issues that's going on in charter schools is longer school days and Saturdays. And I think there will reach a point where teachers, in the beginning, with a lot of enthusiasm, will say, we have to have a limit to the number of
Right.
hours in the workday.
Right.
And they won't have a recourse to speak
Right.
out about that because they don't follow the same protections.
Right.
But they can unionize. They can. If
They
choose
can.
to, they can.
They
right?
can. They can. And I think one of the things that we've been looking at is to begin to look at unionizing charters, but it's a very, very expensive undertaking because each charter is an individual LEA, and the fight to unionize is tough, and so, but in the end, they would be better served. You know, with unions. I mean, you're right. There are teachers from charter schools that we've seen. I mean, boom, they walk downstairs at 3:00, 3:30. The principal says, "I don't need you anymore." Well, why? Because I don't like the memo you sent me, and that's it. You're out of there.
Go for it.
I was just curious about your thoughts on Obama keeping schools open a longer school year, and what, if any, impact do you think that'll have on your work in the union?
I think that the concept of figuring out how do we catch up is going to require some innovative things. Clearly, extended school hours, extended school days, and extended school years could be some of those things to be considered. And I think we have to be open to that. Now, I don't think just extending the school day alone works because I think it's what you do with that extra time. For example, I think even the length of time we have now in the school, we have 7.5 hours. I think Montgomery has 8. PG has 7.5, I think. The key is also to make sure we get the most efficient and effective use of the hours we already have. Sometimes people think more means better. It doesn't necessarily mean better. But I think extended school days, extended school years are going to be a part of trying to catch up, first of all, as a DC system, but also as a part of us catching up nationally.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's going to have to happen.
You know, what does that mean for you and for the union?
It doesn't mean a lot more to just cost more. I mean, if you're working 25 days longer, then someone has to pay for those extra 25 days. So that's what it means. But I don't think teachers are opposed to working longer. But of course, the key is whether or not the financial package can be there to pay for that time.
Well, we do need to get going to our next meeting, but thank you so much for taking
Well,
the
you're
time.
welcome. I enjoyed this. I hope you got some valuable information or,
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
okay.